I previously introduced food and ethics by presenting a quick history of this topic. Historically, ethical concerns about food revolved around food as a quality that gives life. It was influenced by notions of temperance versus gluttony, and acceptance or rejection of specific foods according to religious laws. In other words, in pre-modern times, food ethics centered on food consumption, models for food intake, and private morality. I quickly surveyed Greek dietetics, moved on to talking about some of the Jewish food laws, and talking about what is said in Christian Gospels. We also mentioned sensibilities during the medieval and Renaissance periods. I'll return to talking about how medieval beliefs about food led to starvation among the English settlers at Jamestown later in the semester in the section on archaeology and food studies. But since the 19th century, growing importance of the social dimensions of food production and consumption have dominated food ethics. In the modern view of food and ethics, food production, the ways in which food industries keep us fed, the effects of food on our health, as it is scientifically measured, emphasis on social dimensions, and food related to ideological and social conflicts dominate our modern view of food and ethics. And since 1996, food ethics has been a discipline within the field of philosophy. Why the change in food ethics in the 19th century? Well, by the 19th century, we see huge changes in diet and cuisine. And later, we'll cover these in more detail when we talk about the globalization of food. We see the rise of industrial production. We find more women working outside of the home, less time to produce and prepare your own food, and instead, many people now began to rely upon foods that were already fully or partially processed or even ready to eat. In other words, since the 19th century, we see increased detachment from producing and preparing our own food, and instead turning to buying food, usually at least partially prepared, from a supply chain that can be quite long and involve countless other people in different countries. Is it any surprise that our food ethical concerns have turned to food production and to the social dimensions that our food choices have? Or that food labels have become necessary, both for quantification, but also now for social dimensions? Early points out the relationship between food ethics and other closely associated ethical fields such as medical ethics, bioethics, environmental ethics, and agricultural ethics. He also points out how ethical debate can unite and inform disparate areas of public debate. We see international attempts to legislate food, including the right to food. The right to food is contained in a large number of constitutions, as well as national and international law and binding agreements. The first of these was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came out in 1948. Being a declaration, it is not binding to governments. In Article 25 states, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food. In looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, David Simcox wrote in an opinion piece that the Declaration proclaims economic, cultural, and social rights of the human person, a legal concept not yet accepted by all as a legitimate subject of treaty making. And treaties, of course, are legally binding. So while not a binding agreement on UN member states, the Declaration is a powerful statement of customary international law and an appeal to the world's conscience. Another document, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, was produced in 1966. And in Article 11, it defines the right to food. Quote, the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, including adequate food. And quote, the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. Although this treaty was adopted in 1966 and has been enforced since 1976, and the U.S. signed in 1977, not everyone has signed it and not everyone has ratified it. It is part of the International Bill of Human Rights. You will see from this colored map that unfortunately the United States is one of the few countries that has signed this but not ratified it. In drafting this treaty, UN members recognized that there could be differences. They saw differences especially on the relative importance of negative civil and political rights versus positive economic, social, and cultural rights. And the debates about these eventually caused two separate covenants, one to contain civil and political rights, and the other to contain economic, social, and cultural rights. Amnesty International writes that the United States signed the covenant in 1979 under the Carter administration, but is not fully bound by it until it is ratified. For political reasons, the Carter administration that signed the treaty did not push for the necessary review of the covenant by the Senate, which must give its advice and consent before the U.S. can ratify a treaty. Remember, treaties are legal documents. The Reagan and George H.W. Bush administration took the view that economic, social, and cultural rights were not really rights, but merely desirable social goals, and therefore should not be the object of binding treaties. The Clinton administration did not deny the nature of these rights, but did not find it politically expedient to engage in a battle with Congress over the covenant. The George W. Bush administration followed in line with the view of the previous Bush administration. The Obama administration stated, quote, "The administration does not seek action at this time on the covenant." The Heritage Foundation, a critical conservative think tank, argues that signing it would obligate the introduction of policies that it opposes, such as universal health care. And according to a newspaper article by Simcox in 2018, Secretary of State Tillerson's recent statement to Congress that, quote, "Human rights are a value and not a policy," suggests a similar lack of zeal in the Trump administration. What does Article 11 in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights say? It says that parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food. They recognize the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger and shall take programs as needed to improve methods of production, conservation, and distribution of food by making full use of technical and scientific knowledge, by disseminating knowledge of the principles of nutrition, and by developing or reforming agrarian systems in such a way as to achieve the most efficient development and utilization of natural resources, and by taking into account the problems of both food importing and food exporting countries to ensure an equitable distribution of world food supplies in relation to need. Article 11 recognized the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, which includes, but is not limited to, the right to adequate food. And the right to food implies a right to water. It also creates an obligation on parties to work together to eliminate world hunger. The right to adequate food is distinct from the right to be free from hunger. Free from hunger says that a person receives at least the minimum daily food intake needed to stay alive. The right to adequate food acknowledges the importance of the cultural appropriateness of the food, something that we'll be talking about a lot more this semester. So the right to food is a legal concept with relatively clear and binding normative content, whereas food security is a policy concept which has been used only in non-binding agreements in international documents. In an article introducing the new journal Food Ethics in 2016, Kaiser and Algers list 5 grand global challenges associated with food. Food and population growth. This has been a concern for a long time. As the population continues to grow worldwide, can we continue to feed ourselves? Food and climate change. Basically, agriculture adds to greenhouse gas production. Greenhouse gas production drives climate change, and climate change impacts agriculture, often negatively. Food and access to natural resources. We see a decline in resources from their overuse. The fourth issue is food and global health issues, looking at food-related diseases such as obesity and diabetes. And the fifth grand global challenge that they list is food in the global markets. What do we see except growth in economic inequalities? In our reading for today, Dixon, 2013, Learning to See Food Justice, Dixon asks two questions. Why should we cultivate ethical perception about food justice? And how best should we encourage our students and ourselves to look at the world in a new way? In talking about why individuals do not always eat a healthy diet, one common master narrative or framework is the so-called food is a personal choice master narrative, which states that we can freely choose to change our personal diet. All we need is information on what constitutes a healthy diet. In other words, given knowledge, we can choose to change our diet or not. This master narrative assumes that food choices are unconstrained. Your first extra credit assignment was to tell me a story about some food injustice you have witnessed or experienced in your life. More than anything, your narratives illustrate that knowledge of how to eat is not always sufficient for choosing to eat differently. In other words, food choices are not unconstrained. You may not be able to afford healthy food, even though you know what is healthy. You may not have access to healthy food. You may have cultural barriers to making healthy food choices. Your next assignment in the Food Justice Master Narrative is to list or define local food justice issues as a thread on our discussion board, and then follow up with substantive comments on two other threads. Dixon also asked, how can we cultivate ethical perception about food justice? And this speaks to the question, do we teach or model concepts about food and ethics to our students? In 1998 to 1999, courses that talk about food ethics were surveyed whether or not they were offered at land-grant universities. A follow-up survey was undertaken in 2013. Please excuse the typo. The 2013 follow-up survey of land-grant universities found that in 2013, only 10 of 73 colleges of agriculture offer a course that includes agricultural ethics as a topic. Int'l suggests possible explanations, including that no debate of the ethics of agriculture needs to occur because there is no question about ethical correctness of feeding people. A second possible explanation is that those in agriculture are concerned that ethical reflection will encourage unscientific, inaccurate criticism. However, Int'l and Holzer offer reasons in their article about why agricultural ethics should continue to be taught. The ethical issue brief will be assigned this Friday, as will our recipe share assignment. To continue with learning about international efforts to speak to food justice, be sure to complete the two assigned readings below that are about or from the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO.